The fluorescent lights above First National Bank of Enid buzzed like trapped hornets, casting a yellow pall over the mahogany desk where three men in tailored suits sat watching Tom Bridger remove his worn Stetson. Outside, Oklahoma dust turned the August afternoon the color of old copper. Tom stood there, work boots leaving faint dirt prints on polished marble, calloused hands gripping a manila folder gone soft at the edges, and felt the weight of 17 generations pressing down on his shoulders. The Bridger farm had survived the land run, the Dust Bowl, 2 world wars, and the oil bust of the 70s. But it wouldn't survive this meeting unless something changed in the next 15 minutes. Before we go further, I'd love to know, where are you watching from right now? And what time is it where you are? Drop a comment below. And if stories about ordinary people facing impossible odds move you the way they move me, hit that like button and subscribe. You won't regret it. Branch manager Dale Henshaw leaned back in his leather chair, the kind that cost more than Tom's entire winter seed budget. Mr. Bridger, we've been more than patient. 4 missed payments. The property appraisal came back at $62,000. Your outstanding loan is $98,000. The math doesn't work. Beside Henshaw sat Lawrence Webb, the bank's vice president, a man whose cologne probably cost more than Tom's truck payment. Webb's manicured fingers drummed the table in a rhythm that said this meeting was already over in his mind. The third man, a younger loan officer named Pete Marsh, at least had the decency to look uncomfortable. Tom had known Pete since the boy was in diapers. His father had worked Bridgerland for 20 years before cancer took him. "I'm not asking for charity," Tom said quietly. "I'm asking for 30 more days." Henshaw's laugh was brief and sharp. 30 days to do what, exactly? Pray for rain? Your soil reports show declining productivity for 6 consecutive years. The property is landlocked by Route 47 expansion. Nearest water access is 3 miles. Mr. Bridger, your land is worthless. The word hung in the air like smoke. Worthless. Tom thought of his daughter Jenny, 9 years old, who still believed her father could fix anything. Who helped him feed the chickens every morning at dawn, her gap-toothed smile bright as prairie sunlight. Who drew pictures of their farmhouse in school and wrote "Home Sweet Home" in crayon across the top. He thought of his father, dead 8 months now, whose last words were, "Don't let them take it, son." "I have something to show you," Tom said, opening the folder. Webb actually rolled his eyes. "Mr. Bridger, if this is another plea about sentimental value, it's a mineral rights survey." Tom placed the first document on the desk. Dated 3 weeks ago, from Peterson Geological Services out of Tulsa. The room shifted. Henshaw picked up the paper, his expression changing, from patronizing to focused. Webb leaned forward despite himself. "According to this survey," Tom continued, his voice steady now, "there's a shallow oil formation beneath the western 40 acres. The geologist estimates 15 to 20,000 barrels recoverable with standard vertical wells." Pete Marsh's eyes widened. At current prices, crude was hovering around $32 a barrel in August of 1982. That was potential revenue approaching $700,000. "This is preliminary," Henshaw said, but his tone had lost its certainty. "Estimates aren't guarantees." Tom placed a second document on the desk. "That's a letter of intent from Continental Drilling. They'll lease the mineral rights for $12,000 a month, plus a 20% royalty on extraction. First check cuts in 10 days. The silence that followed was different than before. This wasn't the silence of dismissed petitions. This was the silence of recalculation. Webb's face had gone pale beneath his tan. His fingers stopped drumming. When he spoke, His voice carried an edge Tom had never heard before. How long have you known about this? The question landed strange. Not when did you find out, but how long have you known? The survey came back August 9th, Tom said. 2 weeks ago. Why? Webb and Henshaw exchanged a look that Tom couldn't quite read. Something passed between them, quick and sharp as a knife thrust. And you're certain, Henshaw said slowly, that Continental's offer is legitimate? Tom placed a third document on the desk. The lease agreement signed and notarized, pending only the resolution of the foreclosure proceedings. Pete Marsh, the young loan officer, picked up the Continental letter. His hands were shaking slightly. Mr. Bridger, this changes everything. We should postpone the foreclosure immediately and restructure the loan terms. No. Webb's voice cut across the room like a blade. The foreclosure timeline stands. Mr. Bridger has had months to address this situation. One survey doesn't... Larry. Henshaw's interruption was quiet but firm. I think we need to discuss this privately. But Tom was watching Webb's face now, really watching it, and he saw something he recognized from years of playing poker at the Elks Lodge on Saturday nights. He saw a man holding a losing hand who'd already bet too much to fold. And suddenly, Tom understood why the bank had been so aggressive with the foreclosure timeline. Why they'd rejected his request for an extension 3 times when other farmers with worse debt had been granted delays. Why Lawrence Webb, the vice president of a regional bank, was personally overseeing the foreclosure of a single $98,000 loan. Someone had known about the oil, and they'd been trying to seize the land before Tom found out. But who had told Webb? And how deep did this conspiracy run? Tom Bridger didn't move from his spot in front of the mahogany desk, but everything inside him had gone cold and sharp. The pieces were falling into place now, quick as dominoes. 3 months ago, when the first foreclosure notice arrived, it had seemed unusually aggressive, the bank demanding full payment within 60 days instead of the standard 120. Tom had assumed it was just the economy, the banking crisis that had swallowed continental Illinois and spooked lenders across the Heartland. But now, watching Lawrence Webb's jaw work beneath his perfectly shaved skin, Tom saw a different picture entirely. Actually, Tom said, his voice carrying a new edge, I'd like to know something before we discuss restructuring. Henshaw glanced up from the survey report. What's that? Who ordered the county land assessment on my property back in May? The question landed like a stone in still water. Webb's fingers resumed their drumming, faster now. Standard procedure for all properties in default proceedings. Funny thing about that assessment. Tom reached into his jacket pocket, worn denim patched at the elbows, and pulled out a folded photocopy. I pulled the records at the courthouse last week. The assessment was ordered on May 14th, but my first missed payment wasn't until May 29th. 2 weeks later. Pete Marsh's head came up sharply. The bank anticipated the default, Tom continued, and commissioned a land survey before there was any legal cause to do so. Now, why would First National spend money assessing land that wasn't yet in foreclosure? Henshaw's expression had shifted from concentration to something harder to read. Concern, maybe, or the first edge of anger. He turned to Webb. Larry, did you authorize that assessment? Routine risk management, Webb said, but his voice had lost its smoothness. We assess all agricultural properties in the current economic climate. Do you? Tom placed the photocopy on the desk. Because according to county records, you've ordered exactly 3 land assessments in the past year. Mine, the Holloway Place on Route 66, and the old Morrison Ranch east of town. Interesting pattern, don't you think? The fluorescent lights continued their insect hum overhead. Outside, a car horn bleated twice, then fell silent. The Holloway place sold to a private buyer in June, Pete said quietly, his young face troubled. Foreclosure sale. Well below market value, I remember, because... He stopped, looking at Webb with dawning comprehension. Because you handled that sale personally. You said the buyer was a Dallas investment group. Webb stood abruptly, his chair scraping against marble. This is absurd. Tom, I understand you're under stress, but conspiracy theories won't save your farm. The fact remains, Tom interrupted, that someone knew there was oil under my land before I did, and that someone wanted to acquire the property as cheaply as possible before that information became public. He pulled a fourth document from his folder. His hands were steady now, fed by the same calm that came over him when he was breaking a wild horse or delivering a breech calf at 3 a.m. The calm of a man who'd spent his life solving problems that couldn't be solved by shouting. This is a receipt from Peterson Geological Services, Tom said, for a preliminary mineral survey conducted on my property, dated March 27th, 3 months before my survey. Henshaw took the paper, his face darkening. Who commissioned this? That's what I'd like to know. Tom's eyes never left Webb's face. Because according to Peterson's records, the survey was ordered by someone using the bank's corporate account, and the results were delivered to a private address in Oklahoma City. Not here. Not to First National's offices. To an apartment in the Classen neighborhood. The room had gone very quiet. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to hold their breath. Apartment 4C at the Classen Towers, Tom continued. Registered to a corporation called Midwest Holdings LLC, filed with the state in February of this year, and listed as a wholly owned subsidiary of... He consulted the paper. Webb Family Trust. Pete Marsh made a small sound, almost a gasp. Henshaw's face had gone from ruddy to ashen. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Larry, tell me this isn't what it looks like. But Webb had recovered some of his composure now, enough to straighten his silk tie and meet Tom's gaze with something like defiance. You're making serious accusations without evidence. That survey could have been what? Tom's voice was still quiet, but it carried the weight of 17 generations now. Could have been a coincidence that you ordered a geological survey of my land, discovered oil, then accelerated foreclosure proceedings to seize the property before I found out? Could have been a coincidence that you planned to buy the land through a shell company at auction? The truth was out now, hanging in the air like gunsmoke. How many others? Henshaw asked, turning to face his vice president. How many other properties, Larry? Webb said nothing, but Tom saw the answer in the man's silence, saw the scope of it, the careful planning, the months or maybe years of maneuvering. Webb had been using his position at the bank to identify struggling properties, commission secret geological surveys, then manipulate foreclosure timelines to seize valuable land at fraction of its worth. The Holloway place, the Morrison Ranch. How many others across Oklahoma, across the Heartland, where desperate farmers had lost land that turned out to be worth fortunes? I want him arrested, Henshaw said, reaching for the phone on his desk. I want the State Banking Commission notified immediately. Pete, call Sheriff Morrison, now. But Tom held up a hand. Wait. Henshaw paused, receiver halfway to his ear. Tom, this man tried to steal your land. I know. Tom looked at Webb, seeing not a villain, but a man who'd made the same choice that destroyed so many people during the Dust Bowl. choosing greed over community, self-interest over integrity. But I've got a better idea. What happened next would determine not just the fate of the Bridger farm, but the future of every struggling family in Creek County. And it would start with a single question that Tom Bridger had been taught to ask by his father, and his father before him. What would mercy look like even now? Tom Bridger had learned about mercy from his father on a winter morning when he was 12 years old. They'd caught a man stealing chickens from the coop, a drifter, thin as wire, with eyes that held the kind of desperation that comes from watching your children go hungry. Tom's father could have called the sheriff, could have pressed charges, could have made an example. Instead, he'd given the man a job repairing fences for 2 weeks, paid him fair wages, and sent him home with a sack of potatoes and 3 laying hens. Punishment doesn't fill empty bellies, his father had said, but kindness might prevent the next theft. Now, standing in the bank's conference room with Lawrence Webb's career crumbling around them, Tom thought about that lesson. "Here's what's going to happen," Tom said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd found his footing. "Mr. Webb is going to resign from First National, effective immediately. He's going to transfer full ownership of Midwest Holdings and any properties it controls to their original owners or their heirs. And he's going to cooperate fully with any investigation into banking practices across the region." Webb's face twisted. "You can't." "And in exchange," Tom continued, "I won't press criminal charges. You'll walk out of here with your freedom, Larry. Not your reputation, not your position, but your freedom. That's more mercy than you showed the families you tried to rob." Henshaw was staring at Tom with something like wonder. "You're serious?" "I'm serious about getting my farm secured and getting home to my daughter before dark," Tom said. "The rest of this, the investigations, the publicity, the trials, that's going to take months. Years, maybe. I've got wheat to plant and a child to raise. I don't have time for revenge." Pete Marsh had already picked up the phone, but he paused. "Mr. Bridger, what about the Holloways, the Morrisons? They lost everything. Which is why Webb's going to make it right." Tom turned to the vice president, who looked smaller now, diminished. "You've got 72 hours to start the property transfers. After that, I take everything I know to the FBI field office in Tulsa. Your choice." Webb's hands were shaking now, not with anger, but with the recognition of complete defeat. He nodded once, a sharp jerk of his head, and walked out of the conference room without another word. The door closed behind him with a soft click. Henshaw sank into his chair, looking every one of his 58 years. "Tom, I had no idea. I swear to you." "I believe you, Dale." Tom collected his documents, sliding them back into the manila folder. "But you might want to take a closer look at your other officers. Webb didn't do this alone. Someone in land records helped him. Someone in the assessor's office. Corruption spreads like mold in dark places." "The loan," Pete said suddenly. "Mr. Bridger, we need to restructure your loan immediately. With the oil lease income, you'll be current within 3 months, Tom finished. "I know. I've done the math." He'd done the math every night for 2 weeks, sitting at the kitchen table after Jenny went to bed, working the numbers by lamplight until his eyes burned. The Continental lease would generate $12,000 a month. After taxes and setting aside reserves for Jenny's college fund, he'd have enough to clear the loan, modernize the equipment, and maybe, finally, fix the roof on the barn that leaked every time it rained. As Tom walked out of First National Bank into the copper-bright afternoon, he felt the weight lift from his shoulders for the first time in months. But he didn't feel victorious. He felt tired, and older than his 43 years, and aware that the victory was incomplete. Webb would lose his position, maybe his wealth, but he'd keep his freedom. The Holloways would get their land back, but they'd already relocated to Amarillo, their lives disrupted. Justice, Tom had learned, was never clean. It was always complicated by mercy, by practicality, by the simple fact that punishment didn't undo harm. His truck was parked in the same spot where he'd left it 3 hours ago, back when he'd walked into that bank certain he was about to lose everything his family had built across 4 generations. The drive back to the farm took 25 minutes through rolling Oklahoma countryside gone golden with late summer heat. Tom passed the Dairy Queen where he'd bought Jenny her first ice cream cone, the Methodist church where his parents were married, the crossroads where Route 47 met County Road 9, and the future highway expansion would, according to the bank's appraisal, make his land worthless. Except his land wasn't worthless. It never had been. He pulled into the long gravel driveway just as the sun touched the horizon, painting the farmhouse in shades of amber and rose. The screen door banged open and Jenny came running, blonde pigtails flying, her bare feet kicking up dust. "Daddy! Daddy, you're home!" Tom caught her in his arms, lifting her up, feeling her small body solid and real against his chest. She smelled like the strawberry shampoo her grandmother had sent for her birthday, and beneath that, the clean child smell of sunshine and grass. "Did you save the farm?" Jenny asked, pulling back to study his face with those serious brown eyes that were so much like her mother's. "Mrs. Chen said you went to fight the bank people." Sarah Chen, their nearest neighbor, who'd been watching Jenny during the meeting. Tom made a mental note to bring her a pie, maybe help with her fence repair this weekend. "I saved the farm," Tom said. Jenny whooped, throwing her arms around his neck. "I knew you would. I told Pepper you would, and she believed me too." Pepper was the barn cat, an orange tabby who'd adopted them last spring and ruled the property with ruthless efficiency, keeping the mouse population in check. "Did you now?" Tom carried Jenny toward the house, feeling the last of the tension drain from his muscles. "And what did Pepper say?" "She said," Jenny lowered her voice to a whisper, "she said sometimes daddies are like superheroes, but quieter." Tom's throat tightened. He thought about Lawrence Webb, who probably had children too, who'd thrown away his career and reputation for money he didn't need. He thought about Dale Henshaw's face when he'd realized how deeply the corruption had burrowed into his bank. He thought about all the families across Oklahoma who'd lost their land to schemes just like Webb's, and who didn't have oil under their soil to save them. "Sweet pea," Tom said, setting Jenny down on the porch. "I need to tell you something important." Jenny's face grew solemn. She sat down on the top step, patting the weathered wood beside her. Tom sat, and she leaned against his shoulder. "What we have here," Tom said, gesturing at the fields stretching toward the darkening horizon. "It's not just land. It's responsibility. To take care of it. To take care of each other. To remember that we're only borrowing this place from the people who come after us." "Like me," Jenny said. "Like you." Tom put his arm around her shoulders. "And maybe someday, your children. But that only works if we remember that money isn't the point. The point is family," Jenny finished, "and taking care of things. How did you get so smart?" "I have a good teacher," she said simply. They sat together as the sun sank lower, watching the sky turn from gold to crimson to deep purple. Somewhere in the fields, crickets began their evening song. The air smelled of sun-warmed earth and the promise of rain. Tom thought about the documents locked in his truck, the mineral rights that would change their financial future forever. He thought about the oil that lay beneath their feet, ancient sunlight compressed into liquid wealth by millions of years of pressure and time. But mostly he thought about this moment, his daughter's warm weight against his side, the familiar creak of the porch boards, the land stretching out before them in the gathering dusk. Some victories, he realized, weren't about what you gained. They were about what you managed not to lose. But in the back of his mind, a question still nagged. Who had told Webb to look for oil on Bridgerland in the first place? And what did that person want in return for the information? The answer arrived 3 days later in the form of a woman Tom had never met. She pulled up to the farmhouse in a dusty Chevy Blazer just after dawn, when the air still carried the coolness of night and the roosters were announcing the new day with militant enthusiasm. Tom was already up, feeding the chickens with Jenny at his side, teaching her the rhythm of scattering grain in wide arcs so the birds wouldn't cluster and fight. The woman who climbed out of the Blazer was somewhere in her 50s, with steel gray hair pulled back in a practical bun, and the kind of weathered face that spoke of years working outdoors. She wore field boots, denim jeans, and a canvas jacket, despite the August heat. "Mr. Bridger?" she called across the yard. "I'm Dr. Helen Cormack, Peterson Geological Services." Tom handed the grain bucket to Jenny. "Finish up, sweet pea, then go inside and wash up for breakfast." "But Daddy—" "Inside, Jenny." Something in his tone made her obey without further protest, though she shot curious glances at the stranger as she skipped toward the house. Tom waited until the screen door banged shut before crossing to meet Dr. Cormack. Up close, he could see the lines around her eyes, the sunspots on her hands, the intelligence in her gaze. "I didn't request a follow-up visit," Tom said carefully. "I know." Dr. Cormack looked around the property, taking in the barn with its patched roof, the chicken coop, the fields stretching toward the tree line. "Mind if we talk somewhere private?" They walked to the barn, where the morning light slanted through gaps in the boards and dust motes danced like golden snow. The smell of hay and horse and old wood wrapped around them, familiar as a blanket. Dr. Cormack leaned against a stall door, her expression grave. "I heard about what happened at First National. Word travels fast in banking circles, and faster in geological ones. Lawrence Webb's resignation is already making waves." "And you're here because?" "Because Webb commissioned 2 surveys from my company this year, Mr. Bridger. Yours and one other. But before those, someone else came to me asking questions about oil formations in Creek County, specifically about shallow Pennsylvanian-age sandstone reservoirs typical of this region." Tom's pulse quickened. "Who?" "A woman named Diane Holloway." The name hit Tom like a fist to the chest. Diane Holloway, wife of Robert Holloway, whose farm had been foreclosed and sold to Webb's shell company back in June. The Holloways had 3 children, the youngest just 4 years old. They'd relocated to Amarillo after the foreclosure, Robert taking work at a meatpacking plant for wages that barely covered rent on their 2-bedroom apartment. "Diane came to me in February," Dr. Cormack continued. "She said her husband was behind on loan payments, and she wanted to know if there was any chance their property had mineral value. Said she'd been reading geology reports at the county library, trying to understand formation patterns." Tom felt something shift in his chest. Not quite understanding yet, but moving toward it. "What did you tell her?" "I told her the truth, that her property sat over a formation that sometimes held oil, but that proper surveying would cost $15,000 they didn't have. She asked me what the odds were. I said maybe 1 in 10. Dr. Cormack's voice softened. She thanked me, paid for the consultation with money I suspect she couldn't spare, and left. And then 2 weeks later, Lawrence Webb showed up at my office with a corporate check and authorization to survey the Holloway property. Confidential survey. Results to his private address only. Dr. Cormack met Tom's eyes. The survey came back positive. Significant reserves. I delivered the report to Webb personally, and 6 weeks later, the Holloway farm went into foreclosure. The pieces were arranging themselves into a picture Tom didn't want to see. Diane was trying to save her family's land, Tom said slowly. But by asking about the oil, she tipped off someone who saw an opportunity. Not someone. Webb's administrative assistant was the receptionist at my office during the consultation. She must have mentioned Diane's inquiry to Webb, and he put it together. Desperate farmer, potentially valuable land, accelerated foreclosure timeline. Dr. Cormack's jaw tightened. I've spent 3 days going through my records, Mr. Bridger. Every consultation, every casual inquiry, cross-referencing them with Webb's survey requests. He's been mining my client lists for 2 years. Tom thought about Diane Holloway, who'd tried to be clever, who'd gone to the library and learned enough geology to ask dangerous questions, who'd been trying to save her family and instead had provided the blueprint for their destruction. Does she know? Tom asked. Does Diane know that her inquiry led to the foreclosure? I don't know. I haven't contacted her. I came to you first because... Dr. Cormack hesitated. Because you're the one who stopped him. And because I need to know what you're going to do with this information. Tom walked to the barn door, looking out at the land his family had worked for generations. In the house, he could hear Jenny singing to herself, some made-up song about chickens and cowboys. The sound was pure and uncomplicated. The sound of a childhood that hadn't yet learned about moral complexity. What would mercy look like now? If Diane learned that her attempt to save her family had actually doomed them, it would destroy her. The guilt would be unbearable, even though she'd done nothing wrong, had only tried to be resourceful in the face of losing everything. But the Holloways deserved to know why they'd lost their farm, didn't they? The Holloways are getting their land back, Tom said finally. Webb agreed to transfer all properties acquired through Midwest Holdings. That means their farm, their mineral rights, everything. That's good. Dr. Cormack sounded relieved. But it doesn't answer my question. What about Diane? She has a right to know. She has a right to get her life back without carrying guilt for something that wasn't her fault, Tom interrupted. Webb made the choice to use privileged information. Webb manipulated the foreclosure. Webb's the one who belongs in prison, not Diane's conscience. Dr. Cormack studied him for a long moment. You're protecting her. I'm protecting her family from unnecessary pain. There's a difference between truth and cruelty, Dr. Cormack. Sometimes mercy means knowing which truths need telling and which ones just open old wounds. The geologist nodded slowly. Your father would be proud of you. You knew my father? Surveyed his land back in '68. He found out we'd discovered a small gas pocket on the southern 40. Wasn't worth much, maybe $5,000 over its lifetime. He could have leased it, taken the money. Instead, he capped the well and planted over it. Said he didn't want drilling equipment scaring his cows. Dr. Cormack smiled at the memory. He told me some things were worth more than money. Looks like that lesson took. After Dr. Cormack left, Tom stood in the barn doorway watching the sun climb higher, burning off the morning coolness. Jenny appeared at his elbow, barefoot despite his constant reminders about shoes, her hair still uncombed. Was that lady here about the oil? She asked. In a way. Are we rich now? Tom thought about the Continental lease, about the $12,000 a month that would transform their financial future, about the college fund he could establish, the equipment he could buy, the security they'd have. No, sweet pea, he said. We're just a little less poor. Oh. Jenny considered this. Is that good enough? Tom picked her up, even though she was getting too big for carrying, even though his back would complain later. He held her close and breathed in the strawberry shampoo smell of her hair. It's more than enough, he said. But that night, after Jenny was asleep and the house was quiet except for the creaking of old boards settling, Tom sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold and thought about all the families who'd lost everything to men like Lawrence Webb. The Holloways would get their land back, yes. But what about the others? What about the families who'd already sold, who'd moved away, who'd given up and scattered like dust across the prairie wind? Justice was never complete. Mercy was never enough. And somewhere in the gap between the two, good people suffered while trying to simply survive. 2 weeks after the confrontation at First National, Tom received a letter that would force him to choose between the quiet life he'd fought to preserve and a fight that could consume everything. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday, mixed in with the usual farm correspondence, seed catalogs, equipment financing offers, a postcard from Jenny's grandmother in Tulsa. But this envelope was different. Thick, cream-colored paper, hand-addressed in careful script, postmarked from Amarillo, Texas. Tom opened it standing by the mailbox, the September sun warm on his shoulders. Dear Mr. Bridger, you don't know me, but my name is Diane Holloway. I heard what you did at First National Bank, how you exposed Lawrence Webb and negotiated to return the foreclosed properties. I heard you could have pressed charges but chose mercy instead. My husband Robert and I received notification last week that our farm is being returned to us. After 3 months in Amarillo, living in a place where the walls are so thin we can hear our neighbors fighting, where Robert comes home from the meatpacking plant with his hands cut and his spirit broken, we're being given a second chance. I'm writing because I need to tell you something. Something I haven't told anyone. Not even Robert. Tom's hands tightened on the paper. Last February, I went to a geological consulting firm. I'd been reading everything I could about oil formations, trying to understand if our land might have value beyond what the bank appraisers claimed. I paid for a consultation with money we couldn't spare, asking questions I barely understood. 2 months later, we lost everything. I've spent 3 months wondering if my questions somehow caused our foreclosure, if I drew attention to our property by asking about oil, if my attempt to save us was actually what destroyed us. I know you have your own family to protect, your own concerns. But Mr. Bridger, I need to know the truth. Did my consultation with the geological firm have anything to do with Webb's interest in our land? Because if it did, if my actions led to 3 months of hell for my family, I need to know. I need to understand what I did wrong so I never make that mistake again. Please, I'm begging you, tell me the truth. Sincerely, Diane Holloway. Tom stood by the mailbox for a long time, watching dust devils dance across the harvested fields. Dr. Cormack had given him the answer to Diane's question 2 weeks ago, and he'd chosen then not to tell her, believing that mercy meant protecting her from unnecessary guilt. But now Diane was asking directly, and the calculus had changed. What was crueler, the truth that would confirm her fears, or the lie that would let her believe she was safe from her own resourcefulness? That evening, after Jenny was in bed, Tom sat at the kitchen table with a blank piece of paper and a pen that had belonged to his father. The words came slowly, each one weighed and measured. Dear Mrs. Holloway, thank you for your letter. First, let me say this clearly. You did nothing wrong. Tom paused, pen hovering over paper. Then he continued, choosing each word with the care of a man defusing a bomb. Webb used his position to exploit desperate families. He monitored geological consultations, property assessments, any information that might indicate valuable land owned by vulnerable people. Your consultation was one source of information, but not the cause of your foreclosure. The cause was greed. The cause was a man who saw other people's suffering as opportunity. The cause was a system that allowed someone with power to manipulate desperate circumstances. You were being a good wife and mother, trying to save your family's land with the only resources you had: determination and intelligence. Webb was being a predator. Those two things are not equivalent. Your farm is being returned not because of my intervention, but because what Webb did was illegal. The land was always rightfully yours. You never deserved to lose it. As for what you can do now, return to your farm, raise your children, plant your crops, and know that asking questions, seeking answers, trying to solve problems, these are not mistakes. They're exactly what strong people do in difficult times. You survived 3 months in Amarillo. You kept your family together. You were willing to face a painful truth rather than live with uncertainty. Those are the actions of someone with courage, not guilt. Go home, Mrs. Holloway. Your land is waiting. Respectfully, Tom Bridger. He sealed the letter and set it aside for morning mailing. But sleep didn't come easy that night. Tom lay in bed, listening to the house settle, thinking about all the conversations happening in farmhouses across Oklahoma, families discussing loans, foreclosures, survival strategies in an economy that seemed designed to grind small farmers into dust. How many others were out there, asking dangerous questions, trying to save themselves and inadvertently painting targets on their backs? The next morning, Tom made a decision that would alter the trajectory of his quiet life forever. He called the Tulsa office of the FBI. The agent who answered, a man named Harrison who sounded young and intensely focused, listened as Tom explained the full scope of what he'd discovered. Not just Lawrence Webb's individual corruption, but the system that had enabled it. The confidential client lists, the manipulation of foreclosure timelines, the shell companies designed to hide ownership. Mr. Bridger, Agent Harrison said when Tom finished, what you're describing is a pattern of fraud that likely extends beyond Creek County, beyond Oklahoma even. But building a federal case requires witnesses, documentation, people willing to testify. I'll testify, Tom said. It could take months, maybe years. You'd be opening yourself up to scrutiny, to legal challenges from anyone implicated in the scheme. Defense attorneys would dig into your life, your finances, looking for anything they could use to discredit you. Tom thought about Jenny, who just started 4th grade at Creek County Elementary, who drew pictures of their farmhouse and wrote stories about talking horses, who believed her father could fix anything because so far, he always had. I understand, Tom said. Do you? Agent Harrison's voice carried the weight of experience. Because I've seen good people start down this road with the best intentions, and I've seen what it costs them. Time, privacy, peace. Sometimes more than that. Agent Harrison, Tom said quietly, I've got a 9-year-old daughter who's learning what it means to do the right thing even when it's hard. What kind of father would I be if I taught her that lesson with words, but not actions? There was a pause on the other end of the line. Okay, Mr. Bridger, Agent Harrison said finally. Let's talk about what comes next. What came next was a series of meetings, first in Tom's kitchen, then at the FBI field office in Tulsa. then in the Oklahoma City offices of the U.S. Attorney. Tom brought his documents, the surveys, the Continental lease agreement, the records showing Webb's manipulation of foreclosure timelines. But more than that, he brought his willingness to be the first domino. Within 3 weeks, the investigation had expanded to include 6 other banks across Oklahoma and Kansas. Within 6 weeks, the U.S. Attorney had convened a grand jury. Within 8 weeks, indictments were handed down for Lawrence Webb and 4 other banking officials involved in the scheme. And Tom Bridger, quiet farmer from Creek County, became the star witness in a federal fraud case that would eventually recover more than $4 million in stolen property and expose corruption reaching into the Oklahoma State Banking Commission itself. But victories, Tom was learning, always came with costs. The first cost arrived in the form of a brick through his front window on a cold October night, wrapped in a note that read, "Traitor." The second cost came when Jenny's teacher pulled him aside after school to say that some of the other children were repeating things their parents said about that troublemaker Bridger stirring up problems for honest businessmen. The third cost was the way Tom started checking the rearview mirror more often when driving, started keeping the shotgun loaded by his bedside, started wondering if doing the right thing meant putting his daughter in danger. But he didn't stop. Because across Oklahoma, families were getting phone calls saying their land was being returned, their debts reconsidered, their futures restored. The Holloways moved back to Creek County in November, and Robert Holloway came to Tom's farm with tears in his eyes and a handshake that said more than words could. "You gave us our lives back," Robert said simply. "I just told the truth," Tom replied. But standing on his porch, watching the Holloways drive away, their 3 children waving from the back seat of their station wagon, Tom felt the weight of what truth-telling really cost. And he wondered if courage was less about not being afraid and more about being terrified and doing the right thing anyway. Because the trial was still coming, and Lawrence Webb's lawyers had made it clear they intended to destroy Tom Bridger's credibility by any means necessary. The federal courthouse in Oklahoma City smelled like floor, wax, and old wood and the accumulated anxiety of 1,000 legal battles. Tom Bridger sat in the witness chair on a gray morning in late January of 1983, his hands folded in his lap, his best suit pressed and uncomfortable across his shoulders. The courtroom was packed. Journalists in the back rows, banking officials scattered throughout, families of the victims sitting together in a block on the left side. Diane Holloway was there, her hands clasped tight with Robert's, the Morrisons. 3 other families Tom had never met, but whose stories paralleled his own. And in the front row, arranged by the prosecution despite Tom's protests, sat Jenny. She wore the blue dress her grandmother had sent for Christmas, her blonde hair braided with care by Sarah Chen that morning. Tom had argued against bringing her, but Assistant U.S. Attorney Margaret Chen, no relation to Sarah, had been firm. "The jury needs to see what was at stake," Margaret had said. "Not abstracts like family farms or generational property. They need to see your daughter's face and understand what Webb was willing to destroy for profit." Now, with Jenny's serious brown eyes watching him from the gallery, Tom felt the full weight of what this moment meant. Lawrence Webb sat at the defense table in an expensive charcoal suit, flanked by 2 attorneys whose hourly rate probably exceeded Tom's annual income. Webb's face was impassive, but Tom caught the flicker of something in his eyes when Jenny shifted in her seat. Contempt, maybe, or the particular anger of a man who'd convinced himself he was the victim. Margaret Chen approached the witness stand, her movements efficient and precise. She was 43, with iron-gray hair cut short and a reputation for prosecutorial thoroughness that had made her legendary in Oklahoma legal circles. "Mr. Bridger," she began, "please tell the court about the morning of August 19th, 1982. Tom told the story again, the fourth time in as many months, but it didn't get easier with repetition. The fluorescent lights in the bank, the manila folder with his evidence, the moment when he'd realized Lawrence Webb had known about the oil before Tom did. "And why didn't you press criminal charges immediately?" Margaret asked. "Because I wanted to go home to my daughter," Tom said simply. "I wanted the foreclosure stopped and my land secured. I wasn't thinking about justice for everyone else. I was thinking about survival. But you changed your mind. I got a letter." Tom's eyes found Diane Holloway in the gallery. From someone who thought they'd caused their own family's destruction by asking questions. And I realized that Webb wasn't just one bad man. He was a symptom of a system that punishes people for trying to survive. Webb's lead attorney, a silver-haired man named Pritchard from a Dallas firm, stood for cross-examination with the air of someone preparing to dissect a particularly interesting specimen. "Mr. Bridger," Pritchard began, his voice smooth as aged whiskey, "you testified that you discovered oil on your property through a geological survey. Who paid for that survey?" "I did." "With what money?" "According to bank records, you were 4 months behind on loan payments. Your operating account was overdrawn, and you'd already been denied 2 agricultural loans by other institutions." Tom felt the trap closing but answered honestly. "I borrowed the money from my late father's brother, Martin Bridger, in Tulsa." "Borrowed." Pritchard made the word sound suspicious. "Do you have documentation of this loan? Promissory note? Payment schedule?" "It was a family arrangement. Handshake agreement." "How convenient." Pritchard smiled. "Mr. Bridger, isn't it true that you were facing complete financial ruin in August of 1982? That you were desperate? And that when you discovered your property had oil, you concocted this elaborate conspiracy theory to avoid foreclosure and paint yourself as a victim rather than a deadbeat borrower?" The courtroom went very quiet. Tom looked at Jenny, who was gripping the edge of the pew in front of her, her knuckles white. He looked at the Holloways, at the Morrisons, at all the families whose lives had been upended by Webb's scheme. "No," Tom said, his voice steady. "That's not true." "Then explain something to me, Mr. Bridger." Pritchard moved closer to the witness stand. "You claim my client manipulated foreclosure proceedings to steal your land. But according to the loan documents, you signed an agreement that clearly stated the consequences of non-payment. You defaulted. The bank followed legal procedure. Where exactly is the crime?" "The crime is that your client ordered a geological survey of my property, using confidential banking information, discovered oil, and then accelerated foreclosure to seize valuable land he knew I didn't understand the worth of." "But you can't prove my client ordered that survey, can you?" Dr. Cormack's testimony established that the survey was commissioned through a corporate account, but not that Mr. Webb personally authorized it. It could have been any executive at First National. Tom felt the ground shifting beneath him. Pritchard was right. The chain of evidence connecting Webb to the survey was circumstantial, strong, but not ironclad. "However," Pritchard continued, warming to his theme, "what we can prove is that you, Mr. Bridger, have directly benefited from these accusations. Your loan was restructured. Your land, which you were about to lose, is now generating substantial income. You've been featured in newspapers as a hero standing up to corrupt banking. You've—" "Objection!" Margaret Chen cut in sharply. "Counsel is testifying." "Sustained," Judge Patricia Reeves said from the bench. "Mr. Pritchard, ask questions." Pritchard adjusted his approach. Mr. Bridger, how much is your oil lease currently generating per month? $12,000. And, before you discovered the oil, what was your monthly income? Maybe $3,000 in a good month. So your income has quadrupled. You've gone from facing foreclosure to relative wealth. Quite a turnaround for a man who was, by his own admission, desperate and financially unsophisticated. Tom understood what Pritchard was doing, painting him as an opportunist, a liar, a man who'd fabricated a conspiracy to cover his own failures. And the terrible thing was, from a certain angle, the story held together. Mr. Pritchard, Tom said quietly, I didn't ask for any of this. I didn't want to be here. I wanted to raise my daughter on the land my family has worked for 4 generations. But when I found out what Mr. Webb had done, not just to me but to families across this state, I couldn't stay silent. That's not opportunism. That's basic human decency. Human decency. Pritchard repeated the words like they tasted bitter. Tell me, Mr. Bridger, when you chose not to press charges initially, when you let my client walk out of that bank with just a resignation and a property transfer, was that human decency? Or was that a man who knew his evidence was weak and took what he could get before anyone looked too closely? The question hung in the air like smoke. Tom thought about that day in the bank, about the choice he'd made between punishment and mercy, about his father's lesson regarding the chicken thief and empty bellies, about the difference between justice and revenge. It was mercy, Tom said, which is more than Mr. Webb showed anyone. Pritchard smiled, sensing weakness. But mercy without justice is just another word for letting criminals go free, isn't it? Before Tom could answer, a commotion erupted at the back of the courtroom. A woman Tom didn't recognize stood up, her voice clear and strong despite obvious nervousness. That's not true. Judge Reeves rapped her gavel. Order. Ma'am, sit down or I'll have you removed. Please, the woman said. I have evidence. Evidence that proves everything Mr. Bridger said. Margaret Chen was on her feet immediately. Your Honor, may we approach? What happened next would determine not just Lawrence Webb's fate, but whether doing the right thing at the right time could actually change the world, or if the system was designed to protect men like Webb all along. The woman who'd interrupted the proceedings was escorted to Judge Reeves's chambers during a hastily called recess, along with both legal teams and Tom. Her name was Andrea Walsh, and she looked like she hadn't slept in days. Dark circles under her eyes, hands trembling as she clutched a worn leather briefcase, the kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying a terrible secret for too long. I was Lawrence Webb's administrative assistant for 3 years, Andrea said, her voice barely above a whisper. I resigned 2 weeks after his arrest. I told myself I didn't know anything, that I was just doing my job. But I've been watching this trial, and I can't. Her voice broke. I can't let Mr. Bridger be destroyed for telling the truth. She opened the briefcase and removed a stack of documents, carefully organized and labeled. Margaret Chen began reading, her expression shifting from skepticism to sharp attention. These are Webb's personal calendars, Andrea explained. I kept copies of everything. Meetings, phone calls, correspondence. I told myself it was just good administrative practice, but really, I think I knew. Deep down, I knew something was wrong. She pulled out a specific page, dated March 20th, 1982. This is the day after Diane Holloway's consultation with Peterson Geological Services. Webb had a meeting with someone named Janet Morris. She was the receptionist at Peterson's office. Here's the notation. JM, consultation follow-up, potential opportunities. Margaret Chen's eyes widened. He was paying the Peterson receptionist to report on client consultations. $50 per tip, Andrea confirmed. Cash from a discretionary fund Webb controlled. I processed the payments as consultant fees. I didn't ask questions because... She stopped, tears welling. Because I needed the job. My husband had been laid off from the refinery. We had 2 kids in high school, and Webb paid well, so I didn't ask questions. Pritchard, Webb's attorney, looked like he'd been struck. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. We haven't had the opportunity to authenticate these documents or depose this witness. Then you'll have that opportunity, Judge Reeves said firmly. But if these documents are genuine, Mr. Pritchard, your client has significantly bigger problems than irregular procedure. The trial reconvened 2 days later, after Andrea Walsh's documents had been authenticated by 3 independent forensic specialists and her testimony had been given under oath in a deposition that lasted 7 hours. When Tom returned to the witness stand, the atmosphere in the courtroom had fundamentally changed. Webb's attorneys were no longer swaggering. The jury looked at Webb with open hostility, and the families in the gallery sat with the tense hope of people who'd been beaten down so many times that they'd almost forgotten what victory felt like. Margaret Chen called Andrea Walsh to the stand. Andrea testified about the system Webb had built, the network of paid informants in geological offices, county assessors' offices, even other banks. How he'd tracked vulnerable properties across 3 states. How he'd used shell companies to hide his acquisitions, paying cash at foreclosure auctions through intermediaries. How many properties? Margaret asked. 43 that I know of, Andrea said, with a combined value after mineral rights of approximately $8 million. The number landed like a physical blow. And how much did Mr. Webb pay for these properties at foreclosure? Approximately $900,000 total. The jury's expressions hardened into something like stone. But the most devastating testimony came when Margaret Chen asked Andrea to read from Webb's personal notes, entries in a leather-bound journal that Andrea had photocopied before resigning. August 10, 1982, Andrea read, her voice shaking. Bridger survey confirms significant reserves. Must accelerate foreclosure before Continental makes contact. Can't let another one slip away like the Morrison property. Morrison's brought in legal counsel too quickly. This time, move faster. Tom watched Lawrence Webb's face as his own words condemned him. The man sat frozen, his expensive suit suddenly looking like a costume, his carefully maintained composure cracking to reveal something desperate and mean beneath. Another entry, Margaret prompted. August 15th, Andrea continued. Henshaw asking questions about assessment timeline. Need to shut down his curiosity before he connects patterns. Consider accelerating multiple foreclosures simultaneously. Harder to track conspiracy when targets are spread across different dates. The word conspiracy, spoken in Webb's own handwriting, was damning enough. But Margaret Chen wasn't finished. She called Dr. Helen Cormack back to the stand. Dr. Cormack, Margaret said, you testified previously about conducting surveys for Mr. Webb. What you didn't mention was a phone call you received on September 3rd, 1982. Can you tell the court about that call? Dr. Cormack's face was grim. Lawrence Webb called my office and threatened to sue me for breach of confidentiality if I spoke to anyone about the surveys I'd conducted. He said he had attorneys who would destroy my reputation and my business if I cooperated with any investigation. And why didn't you report this threat? Because I was afraid. Dr. Cormack's voice was steady, but her hands gripped the witness stand. Mr. Webb had connections throughout the Oklahoma banking and business community. I'm a small independent consultant. One word from him to the right people. and I'd lose contracts worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. So I stayed quiet. Until Tom Bridger showed me that staying quiet was its own kind of betrayal. The prosecution rested its case shortly after noon on a Wednesday in late January. Pritchard stood for closing arguments with the air of a man going through motions he knew were futile. He argued reasonable doubt, questioned Andrea Walsh's motivations, suggested that Webb had been a victim of zealous subordinates acting without authorization. But the evidence was overwhelming, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. Margaret Chen's closing argument was brief and devastating. She didn't need theatrics. She simply walked the jury through the timeline. The consultations, the surveys, the foreclosures, the profits. Webb's own notes condemning him in his own handwriting. "The defense wants you to believe this was a misunderstanding," Margaret said. "A series of unfortunate coincidences. But Lawrence Webb's journal doesn't describe coincidences. It describes a deliberate, systematic scheme to prey on desperate families, to use confidential information to steal from people who trusted the banking system to treat them fairly." She turned to look at Webb directly. "The defendant wants mercy now. He wants you to consider his family, his reputation, his years of service to the community. But I ask you to consider the families he destroyed without mercy. The children who watched their parents lose everything. The farmers who believed their land was worthless because a banker told them so, while that same banker was planning to seize it for profit." Margaret moved to stand in front of the jury box. Tom Bridger had every reason to walk away, to take his restructured loan and his oil money and disappear into a quiet life. But he didn't. Because he understood something that Lawrence Webb never did, that we're all connected. That when one family suffers from corruption, it poisons the entire community. That standing up for justice isn't about what's easy. It's about what's right. The jury deliberated for 2 hours. They returned a verdict of guilty on all counts: conspiracy to commit fraud, wire fraud, theft by deception, abuse of fiduciary duty, and witness tampering. 43 counts total, 1 for each stolen property. Judge Reeves scheduled sentencing for March 15th. As the courtroom emptied, Tom sat in the gallery with Jenny beside him, feeling the weight of the past 5 months finally lifting. Diane Holloway approached with tears streaming down her face, Robert at her side. "You didn't have to do this," Diane said. "You could have just taken care of yourself." "That's not how my father raised me," Tom replied simply. Outside the courthouse, reporters clustered around the steps, cameras flashing, microphones extended. Margaret Chen handled most of the questions, but one reporter pushed through to Tom directly. "Mr. Bridger, you're being called a hero. How does that feel?" Tom thought about the brick through his window, the sleepless nights, the fear that doing the right thing would somehow destroy his daughter's sense of safety in the world. He thought about his father's lesson about the chicken thief, about mercy and empty bellies and the difference between punishment and justice. "I'm not a hero," Tom said. "I'm just a farmer who got lucky and decided that luck shouldn't be something you keep to yourself." Jenny slipped her hand into his, and together they walked down the courthouse steps into the cold January afternoon. The fight wasn't completely over. There would be civil suits, property transfers, years of legal complications unwinding Webb's network of corruption. But the hard part, the part that required courage rather than just patience, was finished. Tom Bridger had stood up when it mattered, and 43 families across 3 states would get their lives back because he had. Sometimes that was what justice looked like. Imperfect, exhausting, costly, but ultimately worth every sacrifice. Lawrence Webb was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison on March 15, 1983. Judge Reeves showed no mercy in her ruling, noting that Webb had systematically betrayed the public trust for personal enrichment, targeting the most vulnerable members of society during their darkest hours. The courtroom was packed again. More families had come forward in the months since the trial, their stories adding weight to the prosecution's sentencing recommendation. Tom wasn't there. He'd returned to Creek County 2 weeks earlier, driving back through the rolling Oklahoma countryside, with Jenny asleep in the passenger seat, her head resting against a pillow pressed to the window. The oil wells on his western 40 acres were pumping steadily now, their rhythmic nodding like mechanical heartbeats. The Continental lease payments arrived like clockwork, deposited into an account Tom had trouble believing belonged to him. But it was the spring planting that called him home. The wheat needed sowing, and no amount of money changed the fact that land required tending, that crops followed seasons indifferent to human drama, that a farmer's calendar was written by nature rather than courtrooms. On a morning in late April, when the air smelled of turned earth and possibility, Tom stood at the edge of his northern field, watching Jenny help Sarah Chen's grandson scatter seed. The boy was 7, gap-toothed and serious about his work. Jenny showed him the proper arc of the throw, the rhythm that ensured even coverage. She'd grown 3 inches since August, her face losing some of its childish roundness, her eyes carrying a knowledge that hadn't been there before the trial. She'd learned things no 9-year-old should have to learn, that the world contained cruelty, that doing right often meant suffering for it, that courage looked less like fearlessness and more like being afraid and acting anyway. But she'd also learned other things. She'd learned that communities could come together when one person stood up, that mercy and justice weren't opposites, but partners in the long work of making a broken world slightly better. That her father's quiet strength came not from never being scared, but from being terrified and choosing love anyway. "Daddy, look!" Jenny called, pointing to the sky where a red-tailed hawk circled on thermals. "Think it's hunting?" "Probably," Tom called back. "Or just enjoying the morning." Robert Holloway's truck pulled into the drive, dust rising behind it. Robert climbed out, accompanied by 2 men Tom didn't recognize. Farmers, judging by their work clothes and the sun-weathered quality of their skin. "Tom," Robert said, approaching with his hand extended. "These are the Whitaker brothers, from up near Enid. They heard about the trial. Their family lost their land 4 years ago to a foreclosure they always thought smelled wrong. Turns out Webb's name is in their case file too." Tom shook hands with both men, seeing in their eyes the same mixture of hope and exhaustion he'd carried into First National Bank 9 months ago. "FBI's still investigating," Tom said. "Margaret Chen told me there might be dozens more cases connected to Webb's network. If you've got documentation—" "We've got boxes of it," the older Whitaker said. "Kept everything, even after we lost the farm. Wife said I was crazy, holding on to papers about a place we'd never get back. But I couldn't throw them away. Felt like if I did, it meant admitting defeat." "You didn't defeat," Tom said quietly. "You survived long enough for the truth to matter." They stood in the yard, talking for an hour, about lawyers and evidence and the slow machinery of justice, about the difference between legal victory and actually getting your life back, about how to explain to children that sometimes the world was broken, but people could help fix it, piece by painful piece. When the Whitakers left, Robert lingered. "Diane wanted me to give you this," he said, handing Tom an envelope. "She's been working on it for weeks." Inside was a watercolor painting of the Bridger farmhouse at sunset, the fields golden, the sky streaked with orange and purple. In the corner, in Diane's careful script, For the man who taught us that mercy and justice can live in the same heart. Tom felt his throat tighten. She's taking art classes, Robert said, at the community college in Enid. Says she spent so many years just surviving that she forgot about actually living. The foreclosure, all of it, it was hell. But coming out the other side, having our land back, knowing we stood up and fought, she says it's like being given permission to become who she was supposed to be all along. After Robert left, Tom found Jenny sitting on the front porch, Pepper the barn cat curled in her lap, both of them drowsing in the afternoon warmth. "Daddy?" Jenny said without opening her eyes. "Are we going to be okay now?" Tom sat beside her, the old boards creaking under his weight. "What do you mean, Sweet Pea?" "I mean, is the scary stuff over? Can things go back to normal?" Tom thought about how to answer honestly without stealing her sense of security. The scary stuff with Mr. Webb is over, but life always has scary things in it. That's just how the world works. The difference is knowing you can handle scary things, that you're strong enough and smart enough and brave enough to get through them. Even if I'm scared? Especially if you're scared. Being brave doesn't mean not being afraid. It means being afraid and doing the right thing anyway. Jenny considered this, absently stroking Pepper's orange fur. "I was scared when I had to sit in the courtroom. All those people looking at us, and those men asking you mean questions. I was scared too." "Really?" "Terrified," Tom admitted. "But I looked at you sitting there and I thought about what kind of man I wanted you to remember when you're grown. And that made the fear smaller. Not gone, but manageable." Jenny leaned against his shoulder, and they sat together as the afternoon lengthened toward evening. The wheat fields rippled in the breeze like a green ocean. The oil wells pumped their steady rhythm. Somewhere in the barn, chickens clucked and settled for the coming night. "I'm glad we didn't lose the farm," Jenny said softly. "Me too, Sweet Pea. Me too." That evening, after Jenny was asleep, Tom sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the stack of letters that had been arriving steadily since the trial. Families thanking him, lawyers requesting his testimony in related cases, journalists wanting interviews, a letter from the Oklahoma Farmers Union asking him to speak at their annual conference about standing up to institutional corruption. He set them all aside except one, a brief note from Margaret Chen. "Tom, the investigation continues to expand. We're now looking at 47 properties across 5 states, with potential recoveries exceeding $12 million. Your willingness to testify started something bigger than either of us imagined. But I want you to know, you're under no obligation to continue. You've done more than anyone had a right to ask. If you want to return to your farm and your daughter and your quiet life, no one would blame you. The choice is yours. Regards." Margaret Tom folded the letter and looked around his kitchen. At the drawings Jenny had taped to the refrigerator. At the worn table where 3 generations of Bridgers had eaten their meals. At the window overlooking fields that had sustained his family through depression and war and drought and loss. He thought about the Whitaker brothers, about their boxes of documents, and their wife who'd thought them crazy for holding on to papers, about a place they'd never get back. He thought about all the families across the Heartland who'd lost everything to men like Lawrence Webb, who'd been told their land was worthless, who'd believed the lies because the system was supposed to protect them and instead had betrayed them. And he thought about Jenny's question. Are we going to be okay now? The answer, Tom realized, wasn't just about the Bridger farm. It was about whether the world his daughter inherited would be slightly more just, slightly less cruel, slightly more likely to protect the vulnerable, instead of preying on them. One farmer couldn't change everything, but one farmer standing up could inspire others to stand up too. And maybe that was enough. Tom pulled out a piece of paper and began writing his response to Margaret Chen. "Margaret, I'll testify, for as long as it takes." Tom. Outside, the Oklahoma night was vast and star-filled, the darkness broken only by the steady lights of the oil derricks and the warm glow from farmhouse windows scattered across the prairie. The land endured, the seasons turned, and, somewhere in the space between mercy and justice, ordinary people kept doing extraordinary things simply because it was right. The legend spread quietly through Oklahoma farming communities in the years that followed, about the farmer who'd walked into a bank expecting to lose everything and walked out having started a revolution, about how one man's courage had recovered millions in stolen property and sent corrupt bankers to prison, about how doing the right thing, even when it cost everything, was the only way to live with yourself when the day was done. Some said Tom Bridger never touched a penny of his oil money, that he gave it all away to families who'd lost their farms. Others claimed he'd used it to start a legal defense fund for farmers facing foreclosure. The truth, as it often is, was simpler and more complicated than legend allowed. Tom Bridger raised his daughter, tended his land, and testified when called upon. He lived quietly, but not silently, speaking up when he saw injustice and teaching Jenny by example that power unchecked was power misused, and that ordinary people standing together could move mountains. And on spring mornings, when the wheat was just breaking through the soil, you could sometimes see him standing at the edge of his fields with his daughter beside him, teaching her the same lessons his father had taught him, about responsibility, about mercy, about the difference between what's easy and what's right. The land remembered. The harvest came, and justice, slow and imperfect but real, continued its work across the Oklahoma plains. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that ordinary courage can change the world, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Share it with someone who needs to remember that standing up matters, even when, especially when, it costs everything. Because the truth is, we're all just farmers trying to protect what matters. And sometimes, that means walking into the bank when everyone says you're going to lose. Thanks for watching.